Hi everybody, welcome back to the third in this series for the basement modelling. Today we're going to focus on UV unwrapping our model, or our individual models actually, probably going to give them some names and work on those base materials. At the end of this session we should have everything ready to export into Unity, which we'll do in the next session. Glad you can join me. Let's get started. So I'm in rendered view mode here. Let me just quickly flip out. We'll be jumping in and out of rendered view mode as we're modeling, just checking how our textures are looking. So why don't we start with this room and correct this weird issue that we've got going on. Now the main reason for this sort of issues is your UVs are all messed up and we've not done any UV unwrapping on any of these models. So let's jump into UV editing mode, and there's whole tutorials on UVs and unwrapping, and it's quite a complex process. We're going to use an easy process on most of our models. We're dealing with lots of squares and we're burning our textures on later, so because most of our models aren't going to require repeating textures or anything like that, we can actually get away quite a lot with Smart UV Project. So brief overview, if we have a quick look, this face down here, this end face, if we select that face and see how it is mapped inside here, this is how it's looking up that texture. So if we were to look in our shaded view, you can see it's stretched, it's pulled sideways, it's obviously not going exactly how we want it to do. So what we need to do is tell Blender that this is actually a square face and the orientation of that face. So we're in edit mode here, we press A to select all, and I'm just going to turn on my screencast tools because it looks like they're not on. So there we go, you should be able to see what I'm doing down there now. So in UV editing mode, we've selected our cube, we've pressed A to highlight all the faces, and we're just going to search for Smart UV Project. So inside here, Smart UV Project. And what that will do is, that was Blender's best guess on how to unwrap this model. It usually does quite a good job on squares and quite simple surfaces. It struggles a lot in cylinders, which we'll come to later. So let's press OK and see what we've got now. So you can see it's unwrapped it much nicer than the previous one. These are walls, floors, and this must be our ceiling with the cutout inside here. So now if we look inside rendered mode again, we should see much better textures on here. And yep, that looks much better. Obviously they are now vertical and a little bit too big. So we'll jump back into editing and let's select our object again. I'm just using the mouse wheel here to zoom in. The shortcuts in here are pretty much the same as they are inside your viewport. So let's select all these now, press R for rotate, and I'm going to rotate them 90 degrees like that. Now if we look in shaded mode, you can see that the walls are now actually correct way around, but it looks like with this texture that they should be round further. All the shadows are up here. So let's rotate again all the way around 180 degrees. And that looks much better. We've got our shadows down here. Obviously the scale is wrong on here, and you can, if we jump in, you can scale inside here, but we're going to be burning our texture. So if we create a texture later, it will only burn this part of the texture onto our actual image, which is obviously no good for us. So we want the entire thing to be on here, and we'll adjust this scaling inside the actual material. So if we do that now, let's jump into shading. I tend to use the shading tab for playing around with materials because I get to, we don't actually need this panel, so let's see if I've created a new one. And now I've got rid of the one that I actually wanted. I'm just going to pause the video and correct that. Okay, I'm back. I've not actually messed too much with these windows in Blender 2.8, so these little draggy bars were confusing me a little bit, but it looks like he used this side for bringing one back in and this side for collapsing it into the image underneath. So I think what we'll do is just change this to the UV editor so we can maybe see our UVs while we're editing inside here. This one I'm going to leave as our image editor, and this one will leave as materials, and this one will leave as our view, and that should give us everything that we need to be able to adjust our imagery here. So let's switch back around. Let's just have a quick look in rendered mode, and what we want to do is shrink these down so automatically is selected our brick material, which is the one that we want. And if we come over here, you can see if you've used this same texture from Polygon, it will come with this mapping mode already set on, and what we're going to do is just adjust the scale on the X and the Y until we're happy with, excuse me, the size of the bricks. They look a little bit large to me, small, sorry, so let's just do it back, and that looks perfect. So we've now got our brick texture on the wall. We can finish it. We've finished with that one, and let's do our floor. So the grey, I actually quite like this grey. It does look quite concretey, but it is also very uniform. There's no light changes on here. There's nothing really going on because it's just using this principled shader with a base colour straight into the surface, so it's not really doing anything more spectacular. Now you can go into a lot of detail in here. You could go find a concrete texture, you could bring that in, you could apply that to the floor, but we've got a lot of textures to do, and I wanted this tutorial to be, you can actually do this without having to go find loads of different textures. Beyond this brick texture, we only do created textures. So if you're not familiar with the node setup, it's definitely worth getting familiar with this. There's lots of separate tutorials out there, but essentially you take outputs from shaders and you pop them into wherever you want it to do material outputs. And there's a lot of different things that you can add into here. We're going to be using mostly this principled shader because it's got a lot of the controls pre-built in there that we actually want. If I zoom in on here, we'll be using roughness quite a lot. We might use metallic a little bit when we come to the paint cans. We're not going to be using clear coats or sheens or anything, or transmission. We're not going to use transmission. Is essentially to make something, change the opacity on an object for creating glass. But we'll be using the base colour, roughness, metallic, and maybe a bit of specular as we go through. And a lot of these textures we can sort of fake a bump map without costing us any extra geometry. So if I show you that now, inside here, if I just press Shift and A, fortunately it's not updating the keys when I do it inside here, so that's Shift and A will bring up this menu, just like it does when you're modeling. And we're going to be looking for a noise texture, and we'll be using this noise texture actually quite a lot, so get used to where that is. I find this really useful, and we'll see in a second. So if I Control Shift and click on here, I've got Node Wrangler installed, so I strongly recommend you get Node Wrangler and put that in. It comes with Blender by default, and it's just inside Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and if we search for Node Wrangler, you can see there it's ticked. So just tick that and press Save, and it'll be enabled every time. So for our noise texture, essentially it's doing this pattern on the floor, and we're obviously not going to use it for the colour because we don't want too much of a psychedelic floor. But what we can do now is drop this colour straight into the displacement, and you can see where you had those different shades of colour in this noise texture, it's now created some shadowing on the floor, and this is fake. If I come down and look straight across, you can see it's still a flat plane. All it's really doing is bouncing the light slightly differently, so the light is reacting differently based on this displacement. And the main ones that we're going to be adjusting with are detail and scale. So if we put detail all the way up, you can see there's a lot more divots and adjustments to this texture, and this is really going to be personal preference on a lot of these. I tend to do this a lot on my materials and adjust all these settings until I'm happy with what we've got for that particular surface. It's very cheap and it creates a nice, more interesting texture. So I think actually I'm quite like this texture. It looks nice. So I think let's leave that one alone and we can probably move on. That's the entire room done, nice and simply. I'll try move into this mode when I'm moving around just so it's a bit smoother for you to watch. Let's start over here with our steps again, as we seem to be starting on the steps in every single video. And let's jump into edit mode, and nope, we don't need edit mode, sorry, stairwood mode. And let's put this into rendered so we can see what it looks like. And again, very flat texture. So let's just do the exact same trick we did before. Texture, noise texture, connect the color to the displacement. Now this has not come out quite anywhere near as nicely as our floor did, and that's just due to this shape. So what we can do here is start to stretch these out. So node wrangler installed, click on your noise texture and press Ctrl T, and that will bring you up this mapping and texture coordinates, the same ones that we used when we edited our brick textures. And it will also allow us to scale. So if we move this scale up, you can see we're getting this sort of more detailed, it's almost like zebra wood texture. I'm just going to put the detail level up, I'm going to scale down, and I've not really memorized any of these. I'm just really going on, I'm just adjusting the sliders until I sort of get the look and the feel that I'm looking for. So I'm just going to adjust these, let's put this scale up. Okay, so that actually looks okay. We've got a bit more detail on there. I think this wood is probably a bit light, so let's look to just darken this up a little bit. That looks fine. The metal texture, I don't think we need any bumpiness on there, but I think what we could do is increase the smoothness. Now this is painted metal, so we don't need to adjust our metallic. We can just decrease our roughness value, and we're starting to get a little bit of reflection in there, and I think we'll call that one done as well. Let's move on now to the wooden beams, and I think we'll just follow the same routine we've done before. Let's add in texture, noise texture, color into displacement. Let's Control T to add in our mapping nodes, and let's just increase this scale here. Let's increase the detail, and actually that looks really quite nice. I think it's probably a bit too reflective, so let's increase the roughness. So we don't want it to be quite so shiny. Let's just reduce the specular down, and I think we are probably happy with that. Yeah, I think that looks fine. And we're just going to move around the room now and just pick the textures and adjust them until we're happy with them. So we've got this wire. I think we'll just decrease the roughness so we can get a bit more reflection inside there. I believe we use black plastic on here, so again we'll just drop the roughness down. And I'm really just eyeballing this. We're going to be looking at this in VR. A lot of these reflections will burn onto the texture, but it's not quite exactly how it's going to look inside Unity. It will be as close as we can get from Blender to Unity. The light bulbs, now we could come in here and we could increase our transmission, and we should, if I'd have done the right one, I've just increased the transmission on the screw. So let's switch back, light bulb transmission, and these light bulbs will now go you'll now be able to see through these light bulbs. You can see we're getting a bit of bounce light through there. We can it's adjusting, but that's not going to transfer well at all into Unity. It looks fine from one angle, but if we were to burn this sort of viewing with this brown, but then we were to look against this brick wall, it would still look like it's reflecting the brown from the beams inside there. So it's really not a very good way of doing it. So I'm going to leave this transmission as 0, and we will do a material inside Unity for these to give them some glow with some emission. This screw texture I think is fine. We're not going to see too much detail, but we'll just reduce the roughness there. It looks a bit light as well, so I'm just going to darken this up. That's good. Let's jump to one of our cardboard boxes. I'm just pressing full stop there, which it's on your numpad, which will zoom you into the object that you're looking at. So the cardboard, I actually think the colour is fine. Let's see what this looks like if we add a noise texture on it. So hopefully it's going to start to make these boxes look a little bit beat up. They probably look a bit too beat up at the minute. So if we reduce the detail and reduce the scale quite far down, we should only get slight amounts of deforming of these boxes. I'm just going to bring this up so you can see now we're starting to get some deforming in these boxes. I'll just reduce this back down a little bit. I think that looks fine. We don't want to go too over the top. It's very tempting sometimes to really crank up all these and be happy with the way it looks. But I think sometimes subtlety is the key to some of these background objects. That's done all these. We've got our struts material up here. So let's do the same again. You should be used to this process by now. So texture, I nearly said magic texture then. I mean, we can try magic texture, but I don't think it's going to give us the look that we want. And I mean, that is the nice thing about Blender. You can actually just apply these textures and see what they look like once you apply them. Yeah, that's not exactly what we're going for. It's sort of a wavy sort of pattern. Let's delete that out. Something like Musgrave gives you quite a nice camo type texture, so it's really good if you want to put camouflage on anything. You can't see it there, but if we had camo you will be able to. So let's add our noise texture in here. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic there. Let's add our noise texture in. Let's crank the detail straight up. I think that actually looks quite good like that. I think we're probably a little bit light, so let's just darken these up a little bit. Move a little bit into the brown. That looks good, and let's increase the roughness and drop the specular down. That's great, and we use the cardboard boxes on these, so I think they've already got a texture. We use wood on there, so let's do our beanbags. Now sometimes when you use these materials on an object that you've smoothed and we add something like a noise texture in, it can start to bring out the lines in the model, so you have to be careful with this one and just adjust until you're happy with the color. Really, I'm just going to take our roughness almost all the way up, and I think we'll add very little detail. I think that's added just about enough into there without going over the top. And the same with our blanket. I'm not massively happy with this green, so let's just see if we can bring a bit of a different colour in. Maybe we'll go for a dark blue. Now I would suggest if you're doing this yourself, you can go out and find some textures that you like, maybe create a tartan texture for this, maybe find a cloth type texture for your beanbags. What I didn't want to do inside this tutorial really is bring in loads of different textures that you can't replicate, as I said earlier. I think we can get a nice look without having to, if I can select the correct thing while I'm talking, I think we can get a nice enough look without having to go find loads of textures, which can often be a problem for indie developers, finding good textures that don't cost the earth to actually bring on to your models, that you're actually allowed to use, can be a problem, and you start to build a texture library after a while. But I didn't want to bring in anything that you couldn't use, so that's why I'm using a lot of this sort of noise textures to just create something that looks much, I guess, nicer than it would have done previously. And if I'm not mistaken, oh no, we've got our paint cans. Let's jump over to the paint cans then, and let's have a look what we've got. I think these would probably look quite nice beaten up, similar to what we did with the cardboard, just enough to make them look a little bit dented. Now if you try to inspect these close up when you're inside VR, they're not going to look totally dented. You're going to be able to see it's an image texture. But the trade-off with that is it's extremely cheap to actually be able to render these textures in this way. You've got no added geometry, but you've managed to bring in an extra bit of detail that from a distance just makes these cans look a little bit more interesting. In fact, all these objects a bit more interesting without costing you any performance. It's just the texture that you would be bringing in anyway. So I think it's definitely worth looking at building some of your textures this way, particularly for background objects. This is a great way of adding detail. You can use a simple 512 by 512 image and you can apply this on there. You can set it to a mobile diffuse shader, which will still accept lighting, and you can create some nice looking scenes as cheaply as possible, really. So that being said, it looks like all our texturing is done. So what we probably need to do now is UV unwrap these. So what we covered at the beginning with this image, sorry, these walls for the room, we just need to do that to each of these. And what I'm going to start to do is join some of these objects together where they make sense. We've got to a stage now where we don't need to edit any of these objects. We've saved a basement for export file, so we've got our original file. If we need to somehow go back and correct it, we've actually got those things together. So we're going to start to just join some of these meshes up, and I'll probably start to name them as well. So if I pull this down here, you can see we've not been great with our naming throughout this project. Everything is called cube 1, cube 2, cube 3, and we wouldn't be able to find it, so we'll probably start to name them now. Some people like to name right from the start. Sometimes I like to just throw stuff together and just keep going and going, deleting stuff, adding stuff, and then merging them together at the end. So what we're going to do is, if we look into here, we can only edit these objects, and the same within here. But if we select our stairs, and I'll do this in this mode so it's a bit smoother. If we select our stairs and we hold down shift, in fact let's jump into modeling view so that it's full screen. So if we select the first object, then select the second with shift and left mouse and hold down control and press J, that joins these two objects together. So now when we look inside here, you can see cube 1 is highlighted, and that is all our stairs. And if we go into edit mode, all these faces are now part as one. Now you can still move them around quite easily. Just by pressing L for linked will still bring up what you had before. So we've got cubes, so let's call these stairs. So we've now started off some of our naming. And let's jump into UV editing mode, and let's zoom in here, and you can see all these UVs. I'm just going to press Z here, brings up this wheel. So sometimes you can use the drop downs up here, and if you press Z you get quicker options, but I want it to be using the button so you can get used to where they are. So if we move into solid mode, and let's look. All our UVs are sort of sitting on top of here now, and of each other, and you can see from there. So if we were to burn this again, it would only be able to burn into this one space, and we wouldn't get the detail for all of these steps. And these cubes are generated by Unity. So when you add in, I keep saying Unity, when you add in a mesh to Blender, if we add in cube, inside here you can see it's got generate UVs. So each of these sort of base objects is somebody's created the proper UVs for them so that it unwraps properly, and that's being ticked while we've been adding all these objects. If we look inside, you can see this would be like a folded up cube, sorry, a folded out cube. So we've had that ticked while we've been adding all these on, which is why we've got all these cubes, but we've obviously since moved the geometry around and we've got some extra things inside there. So we're just going to use Smart UV Unwrap, and I'll show you why. If we press U for unwrap and press unwrap, we get this very peculiar sort of wrapping. And if I jump into display here and turn on stretch, this shows you how much each of these faces is being stretched with inside the texture. You can see these are all being stretched a lot. This is a massive cube from somewhere. These are again being stretched out, and this is not really what we want. So we could come through here and we could start to look at all these seams, and we could select them, and we could mark these as a seam. And in fact, if we do that, so if we mark this other side as a seam, and then we go into unwrap, I'm just going to click this. This syncs your display, so whatever you select over here will select over here. And if we select this face, you can see that face has now been unwrapped correctly, or at least that particular one. I wouldn't say it's correctly, but it's been, Blender's been told to cut round here and create this as a separate island. Now we can do that on all this entire model, but again we're going to be baking our textures, so we're not going to be using a repeating texture, so we don't need to do that. What we can use is Smart UV Project, and this will be Blender's best guess, and it will create us a nice tidy map. All these faces will have been created for us, unwrapped, nice and flat, and no stretching. Sorry for the interruption. You probably just see me fade in and fade out. You might see that a few times. Just if I get interrupted, I need to restart the video from somewhere. So we were unwrapping our stairs, longer for me than it was for you. The stairs are now all unwrapped, but one thing to note is that the islands are completely next to each other. So if we're going to bake out our texture later, you'll see there's a margin mark, which you can't actually see because of my head. So if I move this out, you can see just down here is a margin, and this will use an extra 16 pixels around each side of the islands, and it will bake part of that texture onto there. Now we want a margin because it does help to allow your graphics card to generate a little wider than your island rather than exactly on the line. So, but we'll reduce our margin down, and let me just pop my face back down to this corner. So what we want to do inside our UVs is allow enough space for that. So if we UV unwrap again and go to Smart UV Project, and we've got this island margin. If we increase this, if we drop into here, you'll be able to see this in real time. So we can increase and our margins. Obviously it means we're using less texture space than we would before, but we've got a nice area for bleed. Now you don't need anything quite so extreme as that. I typically stay between 0.3 and 0.6. I think 0.6 looks fine for this map, and it's really just going to be experience this once you've done this a few times. And it also depends obviously on the size of the image. If you're building a 4K image, 16 pixels is going to take up much less space than the other one. We'll probably use a lot of 2K images with the odd 4K one thrown in there. So yeah, that's UV unwrapping. So that's the stairs unwrapped, and I think we'll just move around the room now, unwrapping everything in the same way that we've just done with that. So I'm joining these together, so I think it makes sense to join these beams. So select those, Control and J, sorry, I'm pressing K. Control and J. You think after so long I won't have to look at my keyboard anymore. I've been doing this 20 years, so you think I won't need to look. Let's call these wood beams. And let's look at what we've got for our UVs. So these actually don't look too bad, but smart UV project. Let's leave the island at 6 and see what we've got. So these are obviously taking, so this is a side view of one of these. You can see by these dents inside here. So I think that actually looks fine. Let's do our struts then. I'm sure there's a different word for these than struts. If anybody knows, leave me a comment. Joists, maybe. Maybe it's joists. Well, let's find that in here. And I think it is joists, so I'm going to start calling them joists, which is going to be confusing because I've got my materials named struts. Let's jump into here. Very quickly, the shortcuts for these. Select the object you want, tab into edit mode, A to select all, U to unwrap. Click on Smart V, click on OK, and that's done our textures for us and our UV, sorry, and it's left us a little island. So I'm just going to do that on most of these without having to worry too much about it. So into picture, A for all. Again, I've lost my keys, so let me just start that. UV editing. So select the image, tab. A to select all, U to unwrap, smart UV project, OK, and we get this nicely done out for us. And we might actually look to join some of these together, so let's join all our cardboard boxes together, and let's call them cardboard boxes, I guess. Very good. Picture frame. What can we join that with? Let's join it up with these square boxes and maybe these. Why not? It's going to be a lot of in one there, but let's Control J that together. Picture frame, shelves, and boxes. So just going through really and starting to name these objects, and that should be fine. We've got our lights to do next, and we've got these cylinders. Now I'm not going to smart UV unwrap these, and that's due to when we smart UV unwrap, if we undo a smart UV project, it breaks all these down into what it thinks is about right. So with these selected, let me select this face here. This is now created a join, or sorry, a lack of a join. So what we've really got there is we've got a seam over these two here. So it's going to render them slightly differently. Definitely inside Unity, the light map will get confused, and you'll end up with sort of a dark line in the middle of your box here. Now you can't really, now you can't really avoid seams. You have to add some seams onto objects, but what you can do is choose where you want to put those seams. So for these, we're going to unwrap them properly, which are not necessarily properly, but manually. So let's just we can add a seam all the way around the top. So if I switch into edge mode, hold down Alt and click on this, it will do select this entire edge loop, space and mark seam. Now that's told Blender to take a pair of scissors, cut around here and treat that as a separate island. So if we UV unwrap this, you can see all these are stretched like we covered earlier, but this one is nice and flat and on its own, and this is a 90-degree angle, so we would expect the light to be different on here. So we're not going to create some sort of weird light artifact that we're not happy with. It should be perfectly fine. I'm just going to make sure I deleted the bottom faces on here because I can't remember if I did or not. Yes, I did. So we don't have any bottom faces on there. So let's jump again back into UV editing mode. And so now we've got this sort of round cylinder on its own. So if we were to take a pair of scissors and cut down one of these lines here, it will be able to fold this flat. So we can see that now. So what I'm going to do is put the seam behind the object. So this is going to be facing a wall. If we get an artifact on here, it's not really a problem. Like I say, you can't really avoid seams, so it's really about the best place to have those seams. And if we unwrap, now you can see we've got this one island, everything is all together, and this line at the end is round at the back, so if it creates any artifacts it won't be visible. So it's a nice thing about cylinders, they're actually quite easy to unwrap. So mark seam, I'm just going to do this across all these while we're here, and let's jump behind and let's just add in a hidden seam somewhere behind. And I forgot to hold shift at the same time. There we go, let's have a look. So all unwrap, and there we go, we've got some nicely unwrapped paint cans. But before we do that, let's join these. So Control J, let's actually call them paint cans, and unwrap these again. So we've got these two small ones which have not been unwrapped properly. So let's select this edge, space, mark seams, and let's select one behind here. So there and there. There we go, nicely unwrapped. That's all those done, that's all our beams done, and I guess we've still got our lights to do, so let's do the beam bags. Now we could smart UV project on these, but we're going to, because this is a curved sort of shape, we're going to have the same issue where it's doing its best guess, and you can see it's not doing a particularly great job. So I think we're going to have to unwrap this ourselves. Now this is a much more complicated shape, and it really takes a bit of practice. I'm not the world's best UV unwrapper. I can normally get by, so I think what we'll do is I'll unwrap one and then we'll duplicate again for another one. So let's unwrap this one since we've already got this sat on top of it. So let's just delete this one out and we'll put that back in a second. And let's call this beanbag, and let's just hide this blanket out of the way just so we can see. If we jump into here, let's follow the same process we did previously, and let's have a look what we're working with. It's not actually stretched too badly, that, so I wonder what this might look like. It's not stretched badly at all. We could start to place some seams in there, but it's going to mess it up. So I think, why don't we just stick with that one and we'll see what it looks like and deal with that later if it is actually a problem. I'm just going to, inside the mesh, select all this, duplicate and move it over, and that will mean that our beanbags are now inside the same mesh, so we don't have to join them up. Rotate this back round. Let's have a look at our, so unwrap, we should get two nice islands. Let's add in our, whereas our, what did we call it? We called it a, I can't actually remember what we called it. Blanket, there we go. I'm just going to join these together because there can be one object. Control J, let's put an S on here, beanbags and blanket. Now I tend to name these a bit better in here because we're going to be taking them into Unity and we want to know exactly what they are once they're in Unity. I think that's fine, yeah. And let's join these together. Okay, sorry about that interruption. You probably saw my daughter just coming in right at the end there. Right, let's continue. So where were we? We're joining all these objects together and we're calling them lights, which have we actually done that? Yep, we have. Right, so let's have a look at this unwrapped. Now we know that this is not going to work well. We know it's a cylinder, so we're probably going to need to mark some seams, but I like to start with a unwrap. So yeah, that's definitely not going to work well for us. So let's, this wire is essentially a big long bent cylinder. So if we hold down Alt and click on one of these, we'll select the seam right at the top. You'll notice I've selected the one at the top, and that's so that if we do get any light artifacts, they're going to be at the top out of the view. So let's mark that as a seam. And let's have another look at what we've got. Now you can see it's done a bit of a better job. It's actually put them all nice and flat, but one problem with this is it's very long and very thin. It's not using much of this texture area at all. So the only real way for us to correct that is to split up this cylinder into multiple parts. So if I select one of these edge loops here, so I've just selected around there with Alt and left click, and if we place a cut in there, that will allow Blender to put a slice there, and unwrap it. So if we have a look, we should see one bigger island here. We would have done if I'd have actually marked it as a seam. So there we go, mark that as a seam, unwrap, and you can see just down here we've actually got one that is much bigger than it was before, and it also looks like it's generated an end cap. No, that must be from somewhere else. So what we're going to do is just go all the way down here and mark some of these as seams, and we can actually do that inside here. So we'll zoom in here, Alt click on one of these, mark that as a seam. We'll go up about 6, mark a seam, so just holding down Alt, click in, marking it as a seam, and we're just working our way all the way up. And I think that one should be fine. We might have to break that up in half, so let's just have a look. And that's actually much better than it was before, so this is nicely done now. That must be because we shrunk it somewhere, but it actually should be fine, that level of stretch. And these circles must be from these drop downs, so let's move on to these. So we need to, again, let's select one of these, and that will allow us to put a slice straight down there. And that's just created this one for us here, which doesn't look too bad. So let's move on and let's just do that on each one of these objects. I think this looks a little bit bent, so what I'm probably going to do is just mark this as a seam and see if we can split that out, and that's worked out much nicer, and we'll probably do the same down here as well. And there we go, that looks fine, and we need to add our margin just like we would if we smart UV unwrapped. So now our UVs are nicely set for those, and I wonder if when we did these paint cans we didn't add any margin in there, so let's just unwrap them again, and it's taken over that, so that's much nicer. And the next thing to do is, the only one that's left actually is our light bulbs. So let's grab all our light bulbs, join those together, and call them light bulbs. Unwrap, see what we're working with. So this is created circles for each of these with lots of stretch. I think we should be able to mark a seam just like we did with our other ones. and that should select half that mesh. So I'm just going to come around and do that on all of these. And again, I'm just going to use full stop just to move closer so we can actually see. This one in the middle is a bit more difficult because we're actually probably going to be seeing this since we sat close, but again, we need a seam, so we have to add it in somewhere, and that's try to unwrap. Now you can see it's all these are still connected, so these are stopping it from unwrapping. So what we can probably do is just mark all these little bits here for Blender to place a cut across, and that should spread it out a little bit more. So if we just mark these as a seam, unwrap, I don't think I marked as a seam, which is a little bit annoying because now I'm going to have to do it again. Let's box select these. Don't actually want that bottom one, so I'm just going to have to select them manually again, and actually remember to mark them as a seam this time. Why is that not marking as a seam? Oh, it has. Let's unwrap. And that is not working. Because they're all still connected to this circle underneath. So this circle is this bit here. This little face here. So if we mark that whole thing as a seam, that will bring that out. That's not that's the one that we did. So you can see now it's relaxed these a little bit, and it's allowed the stretch to be far less than it was before. This is not actually going to be too much of a problem because we're going to be doing this inside Unity, and it is going to have a emission on it anyway, which basically will blank out any shadows and stuff on there, but it's still worth unwrapping while we're here. And what I might do is join these lights up with the lights above, so we've just got one object. So let's unwrap these, and then we'll join them up with the lights above and merge them all together. And we need to select all these here. Just going to zoom in. That's not done it on that one, which must be select and zoom to it. There we go, it's this one. And that's fine. Now you could go further if you wanted and sort of start to remove, add extra ones in here, which will relax it further, but you're going to end up with an object with lots and lots of seams on there, and the stretch is actually not too bad on here, and again, because of the way we're going to be using it, it's not really too much of a problem. So let's take these lights and join them together with our lights above. So I think that is everything ready, so let's have a look at this in rendered mode. It won't actually look too much different now that we've unwrapped everything, but we are ready to go. I think we'll be able to now take these into Unity, and that's often the most fun part. So I hope you'll join me in the next session where we actually get to take some of these across. We'll learn how to bake all these textures onto separate images, how to export these objects, and build our environment into Unity. So hope to see you next time. Like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.